Okay, so it's also important for us to consider the position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples within a global human rights context. So what I'd like to do in this section is to think about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how that has been used as a tool for us to analyse the experience of Indigenous peoples in the Australian context. So there's absolutely no getting around the fact that the United Nations was and often remains problematic for Indigenous peoples because it's comprised of nation states, and Indigenous peoples are often minorities within their own lands without full and active participation in political processes. Okay, so if we look, for instance, in Australia, the delegation to the United Nations Permanent Forum is on behalf of our nation state. So that needs to be supported by the Australian federal government. Okay. And so what we then see is that, for instance, if the United Nations finds that Australia is contravening any of their human rights instruments, it's the federal government that responds. Okay, so as we go through the lecture, we're going to see how sometimes the federal government responds in ways which are in the interests of itself rather than in the interests of Indigenous peoples. Okay, what we can see more so in other countries than in Australia is processes which structurally gag Indigenous peoples, silence them from being able to speak altogether. All right, so the Declaration, and from the Declaration, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, are both means through which Indigenous people can have a greater say in the United Nations and potentially within their own countries. But let's be really clear. Groups like the Permanent Forum don't have voting power in determining the direction, or the actions that the United Nations will take. So quite often what needs to happen is these forums become the place where Indigenous peoples can raise what they see as human rights violations and then use that to exert pressure on nation states. Okay, so there's not direct power in many of these different forums. Okay, they become a catalyst or a lever for other actions to take place in places like the General Assembly. All right. So it's sometimes argued, why do we need a declaration on the rights of Indigenous people? Wouldn't that be covered by the rights that, quote, everyone has? So we already saw in our previous week that there's a declaration on human rights. What is different then about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And, this question about wouldn't that be covered by the rights that everyone has, I think speaks to some of the discussions that are happening globally at the moment. So, for instance, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, and then we have people saying in response to that, well, yes, but don't all lives matter? Well, the reality is that when we look at the experience of, quote unquote, Black peoples globally, they often experience levels of violence, levels of incarceration, lower socioeconomic status, and a whole range of other social and economic and cultural indicators in a very different way to, say, the mainstream population. So yes, of course all lives matter, But statistically, non-black people don't have the same levels of, for instance, deaths in custody, and often not the same levels of incarceration, even to begin with. We can also see that non-black peoples are often more represented in places like the police. And I've chosen my language really carefully there, because what we'll often see in our media or in academic works is we talk about the opposite. We talk about non-white people, okay? Because in so many Western countries, whiteness, which is this kind of complex hybridity of British and European, Western sensibilities, whiteness is seen as the benchmark. So we very rarely hear non-black people, but we quite often hear non-white people, okay? So we need to think about our language as well in terms of human rights. Okay, so what we're going to see as the lecture goes on is the way in which Indigenous experiences are different to those of non-Indigenous backgrounds. All right. So we know that despite the existence of the United Nations since 1948 and widespread usage of the term human rights, large disparities have continued to exist for Indigenous peoples. And these disparities alert us to a basic failure in the application of human rights for Indigenous peoples, and that is the right to equality in many areas. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples attempts to specifically address this deficit. We've got to remember too that the concept of human rights is a fairly recent notion, even though, as we looked at those different documents, there were elements of recognising the rights of human beings. The way that we use it in our modern context, really is a product of the 20th century. Okay. And that's been, particularly the case in understanding that in the past, there might have been the recognition of what we would now call human rights violations, but there wasn't a way in which this was embodied in the law so that there could be some kind of punitive measure, punishment brought in place for people who contravened these rights. So sometimes there were outcries, but there was no structural element that held nation states to account. All right, so in the tiles there, I've given you two hyperlinks. The first is to the document on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the second is to an animation which was recorded for the United Nations to be shown to Indigenous peoples, okay, and what's sometimes referred to as traditional peoples, okay, and so that's called our ancestral lands. I guess what I'm trying to do in getting you to interact with either one or both of these is to reflect the different ways that people take in information. So for some people, the best thing that they can get is text, white page, black text, in order, dot points, numbered, and they're really happy. For other people, audio-visual materials are an incredibly important part of how they, learn and retain information that they see. And so as we go through the course as well, we're going to look at some of the infographics or, combination of visual and textual representations which have been developed, and are often used in materials to promote issues like human rights to Indigenous peoples. Okay, What we'll also see, I think, as we go through, is that we do need to understand that in the past, there's been such an emphasis on everything has to be text. Part of the reason why we use things like YouTube footage in our lectures is because it enables you to see a different side and to make your own interpretations. Otherwise, the lecture becomes my interpretation of what I see. What we're also providing you with is different voices of Indigenous peoples and allowing you to make your own interpretation. Okay? Because I don't want to, I'm not arrogant enough to think that mine is the only interpretation. Even when you go to do your essays, or other assignments, I'm quite happy for you to disagree with me, with the caveat that you need to be able to prove your point. Okay? So, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples took 20 years to be developed and agreed to. Right? And it is significant because Indigenous peoples were active contributors to its development. So we can see that in many other areas that Indigenous peoples, may actually be considered in some of the documentation, but they often were not part of negotiating, what that looked like. And in contrast, we can see that for UNDRIP, the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there was involvement by Indigenous peoples. Part of the reason why it took so long is that nation states, many nation states, perceived this as meaning that they had to give up something, that they had to give up rights. And one of the things that we've seen with nation states is that they tend to like to expand their domain rather than contract it. Now, even when UNDRIP finally passed, there were 4, quote, holdout countries. Can you guess who those countries were? Okay, so leaving you hanging. It's very exciting, I know. There are 134 countries in favour, 11 countries abstained, and then there's these magic 4 countries who voted against. And those 4 countries were referred to as the Kansas Alliance: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Now, when you go to your lecture slides, if you click on the article that I've got there, UNDRIP, Kansas and Indigenous Rights, it will hyperlink you to an article talking in more depth about this Kansas Alliance. But I think for us, it's a really interesting one because these are 4 countries that tend to present themselves as being, really strongly guardians of human rights, in particular the United States. But we've seen, Australian federal governments in the past describe Australia as the United States deputy in the Pacific. Okay. What we can also see is that these 4 countries are 4 of the countries which probably in terms of public perception in Western countries, these have some of the most recognisable Indigenous peoples globally. Okay, and I say within a Western context because, for instance, we know that in fact there are more Indigenous peoples in Asia, than there are elsewhere. But for us in the West, we often don't think about Indigenous peoples in Asia or Africa. Possibly slightly more about Indigenous peoples in South America, but it's these 4 countries that really capture that Western imagination for Indigenous peoples. So it was a really interesting case that they were the ones who said no to passing the declaration. Okay, so we can see that, these are often what's called settler states. And often, that declarations like UNDRIP, so instruments like UNDRIP and other international statements on the subject have not substantially influenced the agendas of these settler states. Rather, the political claims of Indigenous peoples and state responses to them are shaped by particular politics, histories, and institutions. Okay, so what we find is that these countries, if we're talking about the way in which they should judge other nations and their relationship with the United Nations, they'll say things like, it's absolutely shocking, that they're going against the United Nations. The United Nations is the benchmark of our human rights. And then we get to something where these four are not consistent and they say, well, we really need to have localized responses because I don't think that, there's a one size fits all. So there's this really interesting tension in the way that these four countries respond to issues of human rights. When they're the ones doing the criticizing, they're all for it. When they're the ones being criticized, they suddenly backtrack into this, apologist kind of, we're actually doing really well kind of a statement. But is that actually the truth? All right. So since that time, since UNDRIP was initially passed, all four of those countries have given their conditional support for UNDRIP. So not unconditional, quite conditional. Okay. And so what they've done is they say that Indigenous reforms can happen through negotiated political bargains outside general human rights regimes. So sometimes, quite ironically, they're arguing that human rights doesn't go far enough and they want to be able to, really address what's happening. It's quite interesting to watch how these debates take place. Okay, so then let's have a look at what a fairly prominent Aboriginal advocate has said about human rights standards. So Mick Dodson said, "The existence of human rights standards is not the source of Indigenous disadvantage. Human rights do not dispossess Indigenous people. They do not marginalise them. They do not cause their poverty. And they do not cause gaps in life expectancy and life outcomes. It is the denial of rights that is a large contributor to these things. The value of human rights is not in their existence, it is in their implementation. And that is the challenge for the world and for Australia with this declaration." Okay, so what I want to pick up on, because it will become relevant later in the lecture, what I want to pick up on really strongly is that he's saying here the value of human rights is in them being implemented. Okay? And it'll become clear, why I've emphasised that point. All right? So let's have a look then at how that can be problematised when we look at the practice. Okay, so for example, the United States State Department, in its statement on the US support, and this is where it became conditional, clarified by saying that the declaration, while not legally binding or a statement of current international law, has both moral and political force. Okay, so not legally binding and not a statement of current international law. So it argues there that it has moral and political force. But when we look at that, it means that there's significant room for governments to determine their own moral and political agendas, which may not be consistent with Indigenous views. Okay, so, one of the things that it was hoped would happen with UNDRIP was that it would be considered binding. Okay, so basically, with statements like these are in particular the 4 countries of the Kansas Alliance saying, yep, philosophically, really great, but, may not be able to be used in practice and can't be enforced. Okay, so straight away, they're seeing the wiggle room. Okay, they're seeing how they can still act as they would like. And that's problematic. Right, so when we look then at Australia, the Australian government statement of, so-called support for UNDRIP noted that the declaration is non-binding and does not affect existing Australian law. It sets important international principles for nations to aspire to. So again, philosophy, not practice, and not enforceable. And I think that, that's the opposite of what Indigenous peoples had hoped. Because one of the things that we have seen, consistently across, a whole range of different human rights indicators is that if nothing can happen to you, why would you want to be consistent with, if you like, a toothless tiger of a declaration? All right. One of the things that we can see is that there are some moves in this area, however. So I've got some footage here about how Canada removed its objector status to UNDRIP, how they made that shift. When I was in Canada in 2019, there were, state legislatures, such as in British Columbia, that were currently debating whether or not to see UNDRIP, as being recognised, as legally binding. So there's absolutely some really exciting shifts that we can see that are happening. Okay. So let's have a look at what it means when these things are not acted on. For example, Articles 26 and 27 of UNDRIP address the issue of land rights and the establishment of independent, impartial, open and transparent process to adjudicate on, land rights. In Australia, no such body has been established. Instead, at a national level, land rights are still decided on a case-by-case basis under native title. And one of the things that we can see is that, many cases of native title are dismissed or stretch out for quite a number of years. We can also see that in no way could we see a native title decision as being independent and impartial. Okay, certainly not in the way that it was constructed, and I definitely argue not in the way that it's implemented. Okay, so native title, still I think errs on the side of agriculture or mining rather than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and still doesn't properly address the issue of sovereignty. All right. So additionally, the government can amend or repeal legislation. Okay, so when we look at native title, it's legislation, it can be changed. And Indigenous stakeholders have no rights in the process. Okay, so you've got your Western government, which is constructed on the denial of sovereignty to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which then gets to be the adjudicator on what process Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can try and establish their sovereignty and ongoing connection. But it's argued that Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples often have, no guaranteed seat at the table. So let's not be in any doubt who the changes to things like native title are meant to serve. And a headline from a newspaper said, "Coalition to change native title laws to protect mining and agricultural deals." Okay, so it's not hidden in the way that, you know, these things are constructed. This is not just some flight of fancy that I'm having. It's, you know, something which is being, you know, broadly discussed in public life. Okay. So UNDRIP Article 10 states that Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible with the option of return. Okay. All right, so, you know, who owns the world's land? Well, an analysis of 82% of land revealed that Indigenous peoples and local communities only have government recognised rights to 18% of land in the 64 countries studied. Okay, and this can be, I guess, quite problematic because Indigenous peoples, through their sustainable environmental practices, are the protectors, if you like, of, you know, over 80% of the world's biodiversity. So Indigenous peoples, you know, not having control over lands greatly diminishes the biodiversity available globally, and then potentially, you know, really challenges environmental sustainability generally. Okay. So in 2007, which was the same year that UNDRIP was endorsed, the Australian federal government declared a state of emergency for Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. Okay. Now, one of the mechanisms that the United Nations has for trying to support and protect Indigenous peoples is that they appoint a UN special rapporteur, you know, a special reporter for Indigenous peoples, and that person is Indigenous. So in 2010, the special rapporteur was James Anaya. And when he looked at Australia and the Northern Territory intervention, he said the differential treatment of Indigenous peoples in the Northern Territory involves impairment of the enjoyment of various human rights, including rights of collective self-determination, individual autonomy in regard to family and other matters, privacy, due process, land tenure and property, and cultural integrity. Okay, so in terms of the actual articles, he had noted in particular that there was issues with Article 3, 5, 7, 8, 11, 15, 18, 19, 20, 23, 26 and 32. And despite significant domestic and international criticism, the intervention has continued for a decade under both Liberal National Coalition and Labor governments. Okay, so this is not simply a case of, oh, well, if there's a change of government, there'll be a change in this policy. Okay, so, you know, what we have with the Special Rapporteur is, you know, a document which generally gets global attention, that notes multiple areas where UNDRIP is being contravened, and yet nothing happens. And so I think, you know, that in many ways really says a lot about the difficulties with UNDRIP not being binding. Yep, there's a problem. We've acknowledged the problem. And in fact, the United Nations has acknowledged the problem multiple times, but nothing happens. All right, so I have some footage here about when the UN rapporteur condemned the intervention. So it made our national news, it made international news. And so, this is the kind of reporting that took place. All right. What we can see also is, longer pieces of reporting. So this one from NITV, and this was in 2017, reflections on the 10th anniversary of the Northern Territory intervention. Okay, so, intervention starts 2007, gets really highly condemned in James Anaya's 2010 report, still going in 2017. All right. And I think, again, it's incredibly important for us to see this footage because it gives us that human face. I think sometimes, when we do our lectures and we do our tutorial readings, it's difficult for us to see these as the everyday lived practice. Okay, so it would be really useful if you could watch this footage. Now, among the kinds of rights that we can see is that it's really important, for instance, that people have access to water. And not just access to water, but, in the case of climate change, potential protection from water in terms of rising sea levels. So we know that Indigenous peoples are among the first wave group to be impacted by changing water patterns. So if we look at the Indigenous peoples in the Torres Strait, Torres Strait Islanders, if we look at Indigenous peoples in the Pacific and in various low-lying parts of Asia, we can see that Indigenous peoples will be disproportionately affected and dispossessed once again. What we can also see is that Indigenous peoples were not the ones using fossil fuels, were not the ones, creating industry that has greatly contributed to deforestation and global warming. And yet Indigenous peoples stand as, one of, if not the most vulnerable group in terms of climate change. Okay, so, we can see that, there are attempts to assert Indigenous people's rights to water, and UNDRIP, can be a mechanism for that to happen because water is so important to culture and to heritage. So I've got a chart here which is on the Murray and Lower Darling network, to try and look at different rights to water. So they're looking at protecting, managing, and owning water resources, for First Nations, Indigenous peoples, to protect, manage and own water resources on their traditional country. They're looking at defending the rights and interests of First Nations members, traditional country and its people, and advocating and capacity building within government so that there can be influence put in place on natural resource management. So there are ways in which, people are trying to use the declaration, and, that's happening in a range of, really interesting ways that I think really should be supported. So let's then look at an international example of how that happens. So how UNDRIP recognises the sacred relationship with Nibi, or water. Okay. And this is, coming out of the Native Law Centre. Okay, so, I want us to not just have the Australian context, but also the international context as well. Because one of the things that we'll find in terms of international human rights is that sometimes it is possible to use what happens in other countries as a precedent for what might happen in our country.